Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're checking out a new affordable gaming monitor from Cooler Master that promises true HDR support, the Tempest GP2711. I wasn't overly impressed with Cooler Master's previous attempt at this type of display, the GP27Q I reviewed last year, which had some deal-breaking flaws like flickering while gaming. So we'll see how this brand new version fares for those after an HDR experience at a much lower cost. The GP2711 is substantially different from the GP27Q in that it switches to using a VA LCD panel instead of IPS LCD, which significantly increases the native contrast ratio while also bringing motion performance implications. This panel is 27 inches in size, has a 2560 by 1440 resolution, and brings a maximum refresh rate of 165Hz with adaptive sync support. It also promises true HDR capabilities by having a 576 zone full array local dimming backlight with rated HDR peak brightness of 1500 nits, none of this edge-lit garbage we usually see in this price range. Speaking of price, Cooler Master will be offering the GP2711 for $450 US, which is certainly a low price for an HDR monitor in 2023. With that said, you are paying a premium for the local dimming backlight relative to other 1440p 165Hz monitors of today, so it's crucial this display lives up to expectations for HDR gaming. From a design perspective, not much has changed about the GP2711 relative to previous Cooler Master products, especially with the stand, which is still a metal ring in the shape of the Cooler Master logo. The back is fairly minimalist with the standard use of black plastic, and there's not much visual flair for better or worse, no RGB LED lighting for example. I wouldn't class this as an overly premium design, but it gets the job done. The stand pillar is a thin metal pole that is surprisingly effective and delivers a good range of adjustability, including height, tilt, pivot, and swivel. Average sturdiness, but nothing crazy. As for ports, we get one DisplayPort 1.4, two HDMI 2.0 ports, and USB-C that supports DP alt mode and 15 watts of power delivery. There's also a 2-port USB hub with KVM switch functionality. That's a good range of connectivity, and I always appreciate the inclusion of a KVM, but to elevate it to great, the HDMI ports would need to be HDMI 2.1. With just 2.0 spec ports, you're limited to 144Hz over HDMI instead of the full 165Hz. The OSD is controllable through a directional toggle on the rear panel, and the inclusions here are pretty typical. Standard color controls, a few gaming features like an FPS counter and crosshair, shadow boosting, KVM controls, and firmware upgrade support. Pretty much what you'd want to see on a modern monitor in a basic interface. Before talking about motion performance, I wanted to touch on backlight flickering with good news to share. As I mentioned earlier, the GP27Q had issues with flickering when HDR and adaptive sync were enabled simultaneously. The ability to run both of those features together was blocked in the initial firmware release and then unlocked through a firmware update, which exposed flickering issues. While I couldn't say for sure whether these problems would appear in all games, it was a significant concern for me. The good news with the GP2711 is that flickering is not present in our stress tests and wasn't seen while gaming, with or without HDR and local dimming enabled. So the same tests that were exposing the GP27Q are not an issue with this new monitor. Right out of the box, you can use HDR and adaptive sync simultaneously, and the backlight plays nicely at various refresh rates. I don't know whether Cooler Master put in work to specifically address this, or the different panel being used here is simply more robust, but either way, the results are excellent. Motion performance is always interesting with the VA LCD panel, and that's no exception here. Using no overdrive, we see that native panel performance is slow, producing a 19 millisecond average response and high cumulative deviation. This panel needs overdrive to be suitable for gaming, so let's see how that fares. At 165Hz using normal overdrive, the monitor is faster than with overdrive off, improving to a 14.6 millisecond average response with minimal overshoot. However, we see quite significant amounts of dark smearing with a dark level average of 27.7 milliseconds. There's a large discrepancy between the fastest and slowest transition, which is indicative of unimpressive VA LCD optimization, certainly not on the level of Samsung's high-end Odyssey monitors. Advanced overdrive speeds the panel up to 12.2 milliseconds on average, but dark level smearing is still present, a much more significant issue than any increase to overshoot. With cumulative deviation in the 860 range on average, this panel is slower than most modern LCDs that we see, especially those that use IPS technology. Ultra fast boosts us up to a 7.74 millisecond average response, but significantly increases overshoot, and there's still traces of dark level smearing in this configuration. I would prefer to use advanced over ultra fast, as visually they are quite similar, but advanced avoids inverse ghosting artifacts. Also problematic for the GP2711 is performance across the refresh rate range. As we decrease the refresh rate, this VA LCD speeds up, which means at lower refresh rates we're more likely to see inverse ghosting using the advanced overdrive mode that's best suited to 165Hz gaming. You can drop the overdrive setting to normal, a bit better balanced at those lower refresh rates, but now 165Hz performance isn't all that amazing. Cooler Master do provide user adjustable overdrive, which can be set to anything between 0 and 100, which is great for fine tuning. This does allow us to improve performance at 165Hz through a setting of 90, but it doesn't change the fundamental issues with this panel, like dark level smearing. We can also only really optimize this display for a single refresh rate. For example, a user setting of 90 produces too much overshoot at a lower refresh rate of 100Hz. All up, the GP2711 does not have a single overdrive mode experience, as the modes and settings on offer are only suitable for narrow refresh rate ranges. Advanced, for example, is best around 165Hz, but normal better around 100Hz, and realistically, neither of those options are great. This monitor needed better overall tuning at each refresh rate to minimize dark smearing, along with variable overdrive to manage that performance across the refresh range for variable refresh gaming. Compared to other monitors, the GP2711 has bad motion performance. It's actually a tad slower than the unimpressive MSI 273 CQRX-QD, another VA monitor, and a fair way behind the Samsung Odyssey G7 with its much better VA optimization. Even up against some slower IPS LCDs, the GP2711 doesn't come out very strong at all. And compared to the GP27Q, this new Cooler Master monitor is both twice as slow at the highest refresh rate and does so at a higher level of overshoot when optimized to this response time. The GP2711 isn't much better in terms of average performance across the refresh rate range. It has a similar level of performance to the G274 QPF-QD, but that monitor is optimized to produce no overshoot or dark smearing, whereas this Cooler Master is pushed to the limits using the advanced overdrive setting. The display is much slower than the Odyssey G7 and its predecessor, the GP27Q, a disappointing result for those that prefer fast displays. Part of this is down to especially bad dark level performance. On average, we saw a dark response of 22 milliseconds, which is much slower than even the still pretty slow MSI Artemis model. Typical IPS LCDs will produce a dark average in the 5 millisecond range, so this VA is approximately 4 times slower, a dismal result for dark shades that produces a lot of dark trailing in motion. You don't even need to view UFO tests to see this in action. It's plainly obvious in a variety of settings. As a result, average cumulative deviation is bad. Most typical IPS LCDs of today, including the GP27Q, sit in the 500 to 600 range in this metric. The GP2711 is way down the bottom at a 958 average, which is poor to say the least. There isn't much to be said about lower fixed refresh rate gaming either that hasn't already been discussed. The GP2711 is slow, and while you can optimize it for each refresh rate using user settings, there isn't much point, as there just isn't a magical setting that fixes the slow response times. To see exactly how these slow response times look in motion and what the effect of poor dark level response times is, let's look at the Blurbuster's UFO test. In comparison to other monitors, you just aren't getting a good experience here. There is lots of trailing behind moving objects and a generally yucky presentation. Cooler Master also support backlight strobing if you disable adaptive sync through the MPRT setting. Backlight strobing does not solve slow response times though, as this setting has lots of strobe crosstalk and double images in motion. Some parts are clearer than what you see without strobing, but it's still not a great experience that I wouldn't recommend. Input lag on this monitor is nothing special at 1.6 milliseconds of processing delay in the SDR mode with local dimming disabled. Combined with the mid-tier refresh rate and slow response times, this isn't a monitor that's overly suited to competitive gaming. In fact, on response times alone, I'd say you'd probably want something else for fast-paced gameplay. The processing side of things isn't disastrously slow, however the overall package isn't optimized for speed. Power consumption is good at just 25 watts despite using a mini LED backlight, which in other monitors has led to higher power consumption than non-mini LED backlights. The GP27Q, for example, uses 41 watts under the same conditions, so the switch from IPS to newer VA does improve efficiency. When it comes to color performance, the GP2711 is a wide gamut monitor sporting 96% DCI-P3 coverage, so pretty typical among wide gamut displays of today. Overall, Rec 2020 coverage sits at 73%, a mid-table result that isn't as impressive as the previous GP27Q, which pushed up to 86%. Nevertheless, this is still sufficient for a lot of HDR use cases. Straight out of the box, the GP2711 is not especially well calibrated, and this is largely due to incorrect gamma. My unit had a noticeable red tint and a far higher than accurate gamma, leading to a darker than expected image and poor grayscale delta E's. This caused significant issues for color delta E averages as well, as the GP2711 does not clamp the gamut to sRGB by default. Up against other monitors, you can see this is quite a poor result and doesn't deliver the accuracy I'd want out of the box. However, the display does come with an sRGB mode, so let's see how that works. Accuracy is better in the sRGB mode, particularly the gamma is closer to accurate, although gamma for darker shades is still quite out of whack, which causes some delta E issues. The CCT average is also still tinted towards red when it shouldn't be, but saturation and color checker delta E averages are significantly improved through the combination of better gamma and an effective sRGB clamp. With that said, I would not describe these results as factory calibrated, it's just better than the default configuration. Luckily, this monitor does have a wide range of color controls that are accessible, with no restrictions over their usage in combination with sRGB gamut clamps, so we do have the option of using OSD controls to significantly improve performance. I ended up reducing the grayscale delta E average to just 3.76 with a largely fixed gamma and CCT average, while pushing color and saturation delta E's below 5, a nice result achievable just through hardware adjustments. However, this did require the use of the black stabilization feature, which reduced the contrast ratio to just 2000 to 1. A full calibration through CalMan can achieve better results without the contrast ratio hit. And these are said results pretty decent considering where we started, although a lot of the work here is being done by both hardware setting adjustments and the software ICC profile. It's nice that a greater level of accuracy is achievable after a lot of tweaking and work, but ideally the display would come a lot better calibrated from the factory, as it's hard to know what settings to adjust without the use of expensive calibration hardware. Brightness in the SDR mode is exceptional, pushing up to 650 nits after the max brightness setting is enabled in the OSD. Cooler Master seems to love pushing SDR brightness as high as possible, as you can see from this chart, which is great for users in bright environments. Minimum brightness is also reasonable, pushing down to 52 nits, which is around the mark we like to see for usage in darker environments. The native contrast ratio from this VA LCD is very good at 3787 to 1 without the use of local dimming. That's higher than the Samsung Odyssey G7, although around the mark of other VAs I've tested. This is one of the key advantages to getting a VA over other types of LCD. The contrast ratio is much higher than IPS or TN LCDs, which leads to deeper blacks. Whether or not this is worth the performance trade-offs will come down to the type of content you're consuming, but it's still good to confirm this is indeed a strength of this monitor. Viewing angles are pretty average on this display. It's good that we're getting a flat VA panel at this size instead of a curved panel. I much prefer a flat 16:9 display, but this does expose the weaknesses of VA viewing angles more than a curved panel would. Relative to IPS LCDs, which have excellent viewing angles, VAs produce a greater amount of gamma shift when viewed at off angles, so things can appear a bit washed out if you aren't viewing it dead on. Not a huge issue and nowhere near as bad as TN LCD, just something to be aware of. As for uniformity, not too bad from my unit. The right hand side had a slight tint to it relative to the center, but overall nothing crazy from a mini LED panel. When it comes to HDR performance, the Cooler Master GP2711 is well equipped on the hardware front thanks to its 576 zone full array local dimming backlight. While not a class-leading number of zones, combining over 500 zones with a VA panel allows this LCD to better control its contrast and produce a much higher contrast ratio for HDR content. The capabilities are there to show bright and dark objects relatively close together with little blooming. The issue with the GP2711 though is its awful HDR tuning. This monitor gets far too dark in HDR content, reducing blacks and dark shadow content well below the correct values. This was captured using the medium local dimming setting, but applies to all of the provided HDR modes and local dimming settings. This is one of the least accurate EOTF tracking results I've seen for quite some time. When we specifically focus on dark content performance, we can see that, for example, when the content is requesting 1 nit of brightness, the GP2711 is producing below a 0.1 nit output, which is extremely dark. This crushes blacks and shadows to the point where playing relatively dark games is extremely difficult. Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty, and Alan Wake 2 are two examples where this monitor is practically unusable in the HDR mode in some scenes because you just can't see anything. I made sure to ask Cooler Master before reviewing this monitor whether it was a final retail unit ready for review, and they confirmed that it was the final experience. So that is very disappointing to discover because what should be a great HDR experience is severely impacted by poor tuning. You can get a much brighter and visible experience for dark scenes by disabling local dimming in the HDR mode, but this kills the main hardware feature of the monitor that allows it to deliver contrast good enough for HDR. While the tuning issues prevent this display from delivering a good HDR experience, there are some nice hardware characteristics here. One area is brightness. The panel is good for 1200 nits full screen sustained brightness, which is very high, as well as 1600 nits for a 10% window, around 500 nits higher than its predecessor, the GP27Q. 2% window brightness hits nearly 1100 nits too, making this display brighter than most other HDR monitors that I've tested. Contrast results are also quite impressive, easily outperforming the GP27Q despite the same backlight zone count. The switch from IPS to VA allows best single frame contrast to increase up to over 300,000 to 1, and while that doesn't match the Samsung Odyssey Neo monitors, it's still a great outcome. In our worst case test with bright and dark areas close together, the GP2711 hits 8,198 to 1, well above its native contrast ratio and roughly 4 times better than the IPS-based GP27Q. Checkerboard contrast is also strong. I think these results highlight why the HDR tuning is so disappointing. The hardware is there for a decent mid-range HDR experience, but with the EOTF tracking we end up with, it's just too difficult to recommend for HDR gaming. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Cooler Master generally do a good job of advertising this display and meeting basic minimum standards. The lack of HDMI 2.1 is slightly disappointing, but they otherwise do meet claims for brightness and contrast. Unfortunately, they do also claim factory calibration with a Delta E below 2, and I just can't say this monitor is factory calibrated. Response time performance is poor and doesn't live up to even a 4 millisecond greater grey rating, but HDR hardware capabilities are decent thanks to proper local dimming support. I was also glad to see no issues with flickering on this display, which was an issue with Cooler Master's previous 1440p HDR monitor. All up, I'm pretty disappointed in the Cooler Master GP2711. There's just too many issues here to recommend, from the poor response time performance and dark level smearing to the awful HDR tuning that leads to an experience so dark in some games that it's difficult to play. The hardware here in some respects isn't all that bad, it just required a lot more work to bring it up to an acceptable standard. The biggest issue for me is HDR performance, as this is the main reason you'd buy this display. This monitor should have a good HDR experience. It has a 576 zone mini LED backlight, it has a VA panel with a strong native contrast ratio, and it can push above 1500 nits of brightness. The actual dimming capabilities and enhanced contrast are very strong for a $450 monitor. It's just totally let down by EOTF tracking that is way too dark. HDR is all about better than standard contrast, but that doesn't mean you should make darks super dark for no reason. HDR tuning is difficult, but this effort is one of the worst I've seen. Issues with tuning also creep across into SDR performance because factory calibration is not good on this monitor either, whether we're talking about the default experience or the better but still not great sRGB mode. However, there is a lot of scope for SDR calibration due to unlocked color controls, and the display does have excellent SDR brightness and contrast. It's really up to the user though to ensure the experience is up to scratch. Ideally, more work would have been done at the factory. While the issues with tuning are largely a software/firmware thing, there are hardware issues with this panel as well. The good news, no flickering. The bad news, poor response times similar to VA panels of old, including dark level smearing and a slow average response. The monitor world has largely moved away from this type of experience in the mid-range or better. The slowness of this panel is definitely noticeable while gaming, and really it's no better in this area than a dirt cheap entry-level VA. Samsung has proven that you can make a VA panel fast for gaming, but I'm still waiting to see another brand do the same. As it stands right now, in the condition I reviewed it, the GP2711 is impossible to recommend as it fails to deliver a good HDR gaming experience, which is the whole purpose of buying this monitor. It actually fails at both the HDR and gaming components, so that's a huge miss. There is scope for improvement though through a firmware update, though of course we have to review products as is, not on the promise of future updates, and I certainly cannot recommend this product right now. A firmware update could solve the HDR darkness issues and fix tuning across the board, but even with a much better HDR experience, it could still be a tricky product to recommend, as I highly doubt this display will ever deliver fast response times. Across hundreds of monitors I've tested, I've never seen one go from slow to fast via a firmware update. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just not very likely. So the best case scenario for the GP2711 after a huge firmware fix would probably be a slow monitor with decent HDR visuals for $450 US. There are going to be some gamers that would go for that. I'm sure some people would be willing to trade speed for true HDR at this sort of price point. However, it would be tough for me to give it a wide recommendation. For now though, we don't even have a firmware fix, so let's see what happens there before discussing it any further. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you do appreciate our independent testing and reviews, then please do consider supporting us via our Patreon or Float Plan accounts. Links are in the description below. You'll get access to some cool benefits like ICC profiles that we generate for these reviews, as well as our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors, monthly live streams, BTS content, lots of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.